Okay, so in the last sprint we worked on installing a couple things, getting a project up and running on Heroku, getting the corporate GitHub account. We pushed everything there. We also worked on implementing a couple things, right? Like a couple of data models, such as the users, the services, the categories, and also implementing a couple of really simple RESTful services that would allow us to retrieve that through a REST API. Yes? So we're going to keep adding to that in this assignment. So these are the three use cases that this assignment. In this assignment, we're going to add 6 use cases, of which each team is going to handle 2. So each team is going to handle 2 use cases. There's going to be 6 use cases in total, but each team is going to focus on just 2 of them. Okay? All right? And you should only care about those particular use cases. Right? And they're fairly self-contained. Right? There are some minor dependencies between these. The only dependency might be that everybody is using the same user object, the same user class. So that will be something that you'll need to coordinate amongst the teams, right? That that if somebody's updating the user class, right? That make sure that they're up to date with any changes that everybody else in the organization is doing, right? And then make sure that every morning they pull the latest the latest from the GitHub repository and they merge to their feature branch, right? So make sure that whenever they're going to push back into the master branch, there's not going to be any conflicts. Yes? There's only conflicts when you have not been pulling, right, and merging into your particular feature branch. Everybody's going to be working in their own feature branch. Yes? And every morning, whenever you're going to do any work, you're going to pull and merge. You're going to pull master and merge into your feature branch, so that whenever you're going to ask for a PR, the only changes in your PR should be the changes that you made. In your pull request, you should only see the files that you changed. Right? You should not see anything else. If for some reason you see other changes, it's because you are behind, that you don't have the changes that other folks have been making. Okay? This should only happen to you for the user class. Right? All the other classes mostly will be self-contained in each team. All right? Okay. All right, so these are the 6 use cases. One of the use cases is that we want to be able to assign or create a relationship between the service providers and the services that they provide. We want to be able to say, Alice is a photographer. That's what we want to say. We have a service and we have a user. And we want to create a relationship between the two. That so-and-so is providing so-and-so service. Make sense? So somebody's going to deal with that. The same team is also going to deal with relationships between a service and a category. I want to be able to say that makeup is in the category of weddings, right? But it's also in some other category, but it's in particular part of weddings. Or cooking or making cakes might also be in the same category for weddings. Yes? So a category can have many services, but a service can also be in many categories. Yes? Right? So creating that relationship between services and categories will be another use case. Both use cases will be for Team 1. So Team 1 will deal with these 2 use cases. All right? You're free to decide how you want to break up the work. Right? The more we progress throughout the semester, the more we're going to let you decide how you want to organize yourselves. Right? In the previous assignment, each team member was assigned a particular task. Right? As we go forward, it'll be less and less. Right? So in this particular sprint, we're just saying the Team 1 is doing these use cases. All right? But we're not telling you how how to break it out. Team 2 is going to deal with these 2. One of them is, this is a brand new data model, frequently asked questions. So every provider needs to be able to answer certain questions. right? Such as, how long have you been in business? How many employees do you have? Have you passed a background check? So the administrator needs to be able to create these questions, right, and edit them over time. Bless you. Be able to remove them, edit them, change the title, change the verbiage. So they need to be able to maintain these questions. So that's team 2 has that. And notice that this is very similar to one of these, right? Being able to create services or categories is very similar. So you should be able to just reuse the code that you use for users or services or categories and just change the data model, right? And you should be able to do that really, really easy. Okay. And besides, I give you code to do this anyway, so it should be fairly trivial to do that. The other use case for team number 2 is that providers are going to be answering these questions, right? Alice is going to say that she's been 9 years in business. Bob is going to say that they've been in business for 20 years, whatever. So every service provider is going to have a different answer to the same question. Yes? Right? So as an administrator, I need to be able to manipulate or maintain those questions, right? Whether somebody made a mistake or somebody added some inappropriate content in there, I need to be able to remove them or change them, or maybe for customer support, I might need to be able to find these questions and change them. Whatever. The system administrator needs to be able to CRUD these answers. So we're going to be able to have to CRUD the questions, and we have to be able to CRUD the answers for a specific user. So I need to be able to select the user and see the answers for Alice, and to be able to select Bob and see Bob's answers. See that? Everybody okay? All right. So that's team 2. Team 3 is going to have to do something similar of creating questions, but these are questions that are not for all the providers. These are questions specific to a specific service, right? So if this is the house cleaning service, a question might be, how big a house? In square feet or in how many rooms, right? Now these questions are not open-ended questions, as opposed to these frequently asked questions. These are open-ended questions, right? Where how many years or how many employees, or you might say, what was your favorite engagement, right? So these frequently asked questions might be open-ended questions, yes. Whereas the service-specific questions might be specific types of questions, a true and false question, or a min and max question, right? Like number of rooms, or a multiple choice question. Yes? So these are structured questions as opposed to open-ended questions. Make sense? And these questions are specific to a service. These are not all service providers need to answer it. Only the service providers that provide that service need to answer it. Make sense? So these are questions for a service. So this is another dependency between team 3 and team 1. Because team 1 owns the services. See that? Right? But team 3 is going to need to create the relationship between a service and the questions for that service. You see that? So there's a little bit of dependency between team 1 and team 3. Make sense? Right. Once you have the questions, service providers are going to have to answer these things. Okay? And the system administrator is going to have to be able to CRUD the answers, right? Either for customer support, or having to edit something or manipulate the answers. Make sense? So this one is a little bit different, right? They need to be able to select the user, then select the service that they provide, and then see all the answers for those services. Yep. So here's the breakout. Team 1 is going to do the first 2 use cases. Team 2 is going to have the second 2 use cases, and then team 3 the last 2. Everybody okay? All right. Now, within each team, each student is going to be assigned a design story and an implementation story. Design story, you're going to be asked to implement, to design either a class diagram, use a class diagram, or use a sequence diagram. It's your choice. Right? And the class diagram or sequence diagram should be specific to whatever implementation story you choose as well. Yes? Right? The implementation story, you're going to be asked to either do a data modeling story, right, where you create a Java class, constructors, setters and getters, create the relationship between classes, right, the one-to-many, many-to-many, and things like that, plus any CRUD that you need to do for the repository. So do that. Or focus on more RESTful services, right, creating the URLs, the gets, the posts, the puts, the deletes, right, and creating the all the service calls that use the repository. Make sense? So you get a choice to choose which one you want. So again, the more we go forward, the more we'll let you choose within some constraints. Next week, we'll probably won't even ask you to what type of story, whatnot. Yes, it'll be up to you to decide to go forward. All right. All right. So a couple of deliverables. As an organization, grab these 6 use cases, okay, and update them in section 3.2. Only list them. Don't go and describe them and do the happy path and the alternate paths. Don't do that. Just list the 6 use cases in the SRS. Typically, a business analyst will be responsible for documenting all that other stuff. Okay, we're not business analysts, right? We're just gonna list them there. Also, just to make sure that the TA is grading these things, create a story and assign it to the TA to make sure that they go and look at the SRS. Right, so the TA is also going to have some things to do, right, so that they go in and verify that. All right, so that's an organization. Also, as part of an organization, next week we're going to be introducing UI design, right? And as a skill for the UI design, we'll introduce the React front-end framework, right? So for us to be ready for next week, we're asking you to set up an environment with already a toy or sample or boilerplate React application already running on Heroku. Yes? All right, so please follow these instructions and create a trivial React application and deploy it on Heroku and provide links to Heroku and GitHub and everything else. And again, assign a story for the TA to go out and verify those URLs, GitHub. Provide the GitHub URLs and the Heroku URLs as part of the ticket. When you assign it to the TA, provide the information that the TA needs as a comment, right, or as a description of the story. Yes? Right? Most of our communication should happen through Jira, through comments, right, so that we leave a trail of documentation behind so that we know what's happening, right? All right, so that's the organization level. For the team level tasks, remember, you're only going to focus on 2 use cases. All right, so what I'm going to describe here is only for the use cases that you've been assigned, okay? Right? So each team member should be assigned 2 use cases. I'm sorry, each team has two use cases. All right? Now, before we jump into exactly what stories each person is going to be working on, before deciding that, we're going to go through an exercise of creating functional requirements for the use cases that were assigned to you. Right? We're asking that for the 2 use cases that were assigned to your team, for each one of them, create 5 stories, right? 5 implementation stories, right? So in total, as a team, you're going to create 10 stories. Right? For team 1, I've already done some of that work for you. For team 1, so for instance, some of the stories might be that we'll need to display a list of providers. We'll need to display a list of the services for a selected provider. will need to provide a button or a link to add an individual service, right? So I've done most of the work for you here, right? These stories should only include the title and maybe a line or two describing the feature, as much as you understand the feature, right? And that's it. Only the title and a description. These are not the stories that you're going to be working on in this sprint. You're just going to be filling out the backlog of things that need to be done, right? Probably most of these stories that you're going to create, you're not going to be working on it. Probably some other team might be working on it. Remember, after 5 sprints, we're going to switch, right? So that things that Team 1 worked on are going to be inherited by some of the things that some Team 2 worked on. So we'll have a chance to enjoy working on somebody else's code. Not. So somebody else might be actually working and implementing some of these stories, right? And folks are gonna whenever those sprints come, they'll be revisiting these from the backlog and deciding which to work on. Yes, right? But that's going to be for later sprints. Again, at least 5 for each one of the use cases. So in total, each team should have 10 stories. 2 for each use case. Okay. So Team 2 and Team 3 are going to have to create their own, but you already see some idea of what I'm looking for. Yes. If you look at the first here, you can see plenty of examples on what you might want to build. All right. So at the end, as an organization, you're going to have 30 stories in the backlog. Okay? As an organization, 10 for each team. All right? You're not going to work on them this sprint. Instead, for this sprint, these are the actual stories you're going to be working on. Each team member is going to have at least one implementation story and at least one design story. So each team member is going to have one implementation story and one design story. Right? So two stories per student, so 6 in total per team. Okay? Right? For the implementation story, you can choose to work on 2 types of stories. One, either a Java data implementation story or a RESTful service implementation story. You choose. All right? For the types of story that you might work, for Team 1, the implementation story might be admin adds, removes services to provider. That might be your implementation story. Okay? Or admin adds, removes a service from a category. That might be an implementation story. Yes? For Team 2, an implementation story might be admin CRUDs an FAQ. Or an admin CRUDs and a provider's answers to an FAQ. That might be examples of stories that Team 2 might work on. Yes? Right? For each one, you need the Java, the repository, and the services. Which one you decide to work on, it's up to you. Okay, notice that if you decide to work on the REST for the service, right, and someone else is working on the Java, there might be some dependency between the two, right? That one might be waiting on the other. Okay? Right? I'll leave it up to you how you want to work on it, how you want to break it out. It could be that, yes, I'm working on the data model and you're working on the REST, but because you've been waiting on me and I'm not responding, I'm not available for whatever reason, you might actually go in and take my Java class and add whatever you need, or add whatever you need in the repository because you just want to keep working on your story. Make sense? Right? It's okay to work on somebody else's code, right? And to do cross-pollination between the two. Right? Ideally, maybe you're sitting next to each other and collaborating, right? And approving each other's each other's branches, right, and merging each other's branches. Yes? Ideally, you're working all on the same table, co-located at the same time. That would be ideal. Okay? So, all right, so that's the implementation stories. For the design story, you can work on either class diagram or sequence diagram. Ideally, the class diagram that you'll be working on would be for the same implementation story that you're working on. Right? If you're working on adding providers to services, ideally, you also are working for the class diagram where you're modeling the user and the service. Yes? So I would break it out like that. So you're working on the design story for whatever you're going to be implementing. Right? Now, the design story should have all the word design in the title at the beginning, all caps, so that they immediately pop out, right? So that it says, okay, I know this is a design story. Yes? Also, there's a couple of constraints on the design stories, right? If you're going to be building on the class diagram should have at least two classes, like a user and a service, or a service and a provider, or a user and the answers for a frequently asked question, or service questions and their answers, or the frequently asked questions and the answers. Anyway, at least two classes. Yes? Right, so some constraints on that. Right, then you're gonna do some backlog grooming. These design stories and these implementation stories should be considered the highest priority to be worked on this sprint. Okay? We just created 30 stories, yes? Plus, we just created 6 stories per team stories. These should be the highest priority. Presumably the Scrum Master and the project manager decided that these are the most important stories to work on, and these are the ones they're going to load the sprint with. Yes? Again, I am being your project manager, but more and more, you will be the project manager and decide what to work on next. Yes? Right? I'm forcing these because there are some dependencies as the project progresses that need to exist for later modules to make sense. Right, next week we'll do some React, and React is going to need some services to consume some data to draw something on the screen. Yes, so ideally these things will be in place by the time we get to React. Yes, right. So there are some dependencies that I already have in mind, and the assignments bear that out. Yeah. So backlog grooming. So grooming, as a project manager and the Scrum Master and the business analyst, they meet every week. They are continuously updating the backlog, right? They look at that backlog, and they're always looking at it, from meetings that they've had with the stakeholders, meetings they've had with the directors, the managers, their meetings with the end users, from meetings, from demos that they've made to folks, and some feedback that they've gathered. They're always going back to that backlog, okay, and continuously, updating the priorities, based on what feedback they're getting from their clients, right, and deciding on what should be worked on next. Also, depending on the technical experience of the management team, hopefully the project manager has plenty of experience. They might also decide that certain things need to exist before others. There's certain dependencies need to be there. We need a database before we have a service. We need a service before we have a client, and things like that. Yes, right. So they might decide on certain things that need to occur in a particular sequence. In this case, I'm playing that role, right? The deciding that yes, this is what I'm going to be working on next, right? Right. But more and more, the team should, feed into this and be part of that decision. So that's called backlog grooming. Decide on what is that we're going to be working on next, which I've done that for you. So on sprint planning, after doing the backlog grooming, you'll have a sprint planning meeting. In that sprint planning meeting, the Scrum Master is going to say, these are the 6 stories that are going to be working, 3 design stories and 3 implementation stories, is going to ask the team to, on their own, volunteer on what do they want to work on, based on experience that they've had, any particular interest that they may have on that particular story. So ideally, everybody would point out and say, "Oh, I can work on that. I'll grab this design story, and I'll grab this implementation story." Right, and the Scrum Master will just assign it to that particular team member. Right. If nobody volunteers, then the Scrum Master will just have to choose somebody randomly. Right? Ideally, everybody will volunteer. Also, I would assume that perhaps each one of these stories might be maybe a point or 2. I'm guessing that a maximum of 4 points might make sense for the sprint, and that you should not carry more than that in a sprint. Now, if you do have some stories from previous sprints that have carried over, that puts a sprint at a risk, right? That you might not complete the actual sprint. That's fine, right? Not completing tasks, right? It's fine. It becomes more and more riskier that certain milestones will be hit down the road, but that's the nature of project management, right? That's we either have a set of stories to work on and have a movable delivery date, but we can't have both. So at the end of the sprint, you'll have 2 stories. Each team member will have 2 stories, 1 design story and 1 implementation story. Make sure to point them. I'm guessing that each story will be about 2 points each, and that folks should not have more than 4 points. If this were in an industry, and you're working on 2-week sprints with 10 days, 10 business days, typically folks would be loaded with perhaps 7 to 8 points, right? Where 1 point might be a day, and project managers usually don't fill everybody's pointage all the way to the top, since to give them some leeway on to deal with other issues that might arise, production issues or bugs that might come in. So they want their folks to be able to have some leeway. Every day have a Scrum meeting, right? Where the Scrum Master is gonna call to a Scrum meeting, and is gonna keep track in a Google Doc every day. What was the status of each one of the folks? It's okay to go a day or 2 without doing anything. I know you have other things to do, other courses, but even then, jot down that day you didn't do anything. Okay, jot down. There'll be a list there. Obviously, you don't want to go 5 days without having done anything. Something is wrong there, right? If there's no entry, it'll be considered as you haven't done anything that particular day, right? That would be the default understanding. Ideally, you would be meeting face-to-face at least twice a week, perhaps right before class or right after class for 5 minutes, 5, 10, 50 minutes at most. The other days, perhaps you can meet remote through email or text or Hangout, or it is the Scrum Master's responsibility to make sure that everybody gives their status, right? And to update the team meeting notes that what was everybody's status, and if anybody was blocked, if any additional meetings were scheduled to deal with it. It's fine to folks to help each other. I'm stuck here, help me. Even in the individual tasks, right? It's okay for folks to collaborate and look over each other's shoulder, to help out and get something going, right? It is a team that lives or dies together. All right, so that's the team. For the individual tasks, For the individual tasks, remember, everybody's going to have at least one implementation story and one design story. Okay. So here I've given several examples on the source code that you might need, right, for these stories. I've given implementations for the users, for the service, for the categories, for the frequently asked questions, for the frequently asked answers. Okay, you're free to use this, any part or none at all. Right? If you are copying source code, copying from mine. Right? Don't copy from someone else's or somebody else, some other team. Right? Start from mine. Yeah, you're free to use any of this. For the implementation story, if you're working on a Java data modeling implementation story, you're responsible for creating the Java data model, all the classes, the fields, the constructors, the setters, the getters. You're responsible for that. You're also responsible for any field that it creates an association to some other class, right? Such as a user and the frequently asked questions, or the user and the services that they provide. Yes? Right? So you're responsible for those fields too. Create the one-to-many and the many-to-many relationship between the classes. Yes? You're responsible for that. You're also responsible for creating the repositories, right? Doing all the finders, all the updates or the deletes if you need to create a new query. Now, this JPA repository might be a point of dependencies between you and whoever is working on the RESTful services. Yes? So it might be that somebody is creating the RESTful service and needs to query the database. Right? If they don't have the CRUD operation, they'll ask you to build it. Or they might decide to go in and create it themselves, which is okay. Right? In the JPA repository, these are just some examples of the kinds of queries you might want to implement. Find by ID, find all, find by some criteria, find some children of some parent relationship, find many to many. So these are some of the queries you might need to implement for the JPA repositories. If you're building RESTful services instead, for a specific class, for any particular Java class, you'll have to implement the common CRUD operations, right? Being able to instantiate one, right? Create one, read all, update one, delete all. This is exactly what you did in the previous assignment, right? So for any new class, such as frequently asked questions and the questions for the services, you'll need to create these. For the relationships between one class and another class, such as a user providing a service or a service being in a category, or the answer of a question by a provider, you'll need to create posts that relate the two classes. For instance, this is what we looked at last Tuesday when we met and we looked at web services. Right? Remember that web services can allow you to expose a data model. Right? So for instance, this one exposes the fact that I'm creating a new review for this user. So this user, I have all the reviews for that user. Or I can retrieve all the reviews. Or I can delete a particular review. Or that I can create a relationship between a service and a category. I can put a service in a category, or I can add a service to a category. I can remove a service from a category, or I can remove a category from a service. Okay? All right? All right, so that's for the implementation story. For the design story, you're either going to build a class diagram or a sequence diagram. Your choice. Ideally, it's the same class diagram you need for your implementation story, ideally. Not necessarily. So as a class diagram, the class diagram needs to have at least two classes. A service and a category, a user and a service, a user and an answer, a service and a question and an answer. So two classes, at least two classes. Make sure that you add the one-to-many, the many-to-many, or the one-to-one relationship, or the association classes. Make sure that you name them the same way that you're going to implement them in Java. Make sure you add cardinality, the ones, the stars, the one ... star, all the cardinalities are there. Make sure that the associations have directions so that they point the way that they're supposed. That the associations have names and have directions. That you specify whether it's an aggregation or a composition, right? If there's a life cycle dependency between the classes, make sure that if it's a many-to-many, that make sure that you specify whether this is a mapping class or it's an association class, right? Whether it's that or that, right? That you use the right notation. Okay. If it's a sequence diagram, make sure that you have all the actors involved, all the classes and objects are interacting with one another, that you have conditional flows, the alternates, and you have the guards, that if you have a loop, you also name it as a loop, and that you have the guards to stay within that loop, and whatnot. Okay? And here are the deliverables for the organizations and the team. I haven't done I'm still doing the deliverables for the individual. All right? Any question? Yes.
I think there was a Piazza post about this recently, but somebody asked if something gets updated or clarified in Piazza, can it be automatically updated in the assignment document as well? If it is.
Yes, that's it. That'd be good. Yes.